In the Philippines, the island of Mindanao and other southern islands have long been hotbeds of unrest and conflict dating back over 100 years. Within the last decade, 3 separate conflicts have been taking place in the southern Philippines. I'll be touching on all of them in this video, including an update I made to the Apolitical World Map based on the research for this project regarding one of the other conflicts in this area. However, I mainly want to talk about the communist rebellion in the Philippines. And these days, it is based in Mindanao and presents a more cohesive specter to the majority of the Philippine population than many outsiders may realize, as of course is the case with the other conflicts in the southern Philippines. The first communist rebellion in the Philippines was the Huk Rebellion, short for Hukbalahap, which opposed at that point the Japanese occupiers and their Philippine puppet state, then continued after the war in opposition to the American colonial government and later the independent classicalist Philippine government. However, this faded out and was suppressed in the early 1950s, and the origin of the current Communist Party of the Philippines and its rebellion is in 1969. There, a member of the old Communist Party of the Philippines, Jose Maria Sison, along with professional revolutionary and former Huk member Bernabe Buscaino, created a new communist party backed up by Buscaino's revolutionary fighters, which he now called the New People's Army, for the purpose of transitioning to a Maoist form of quote-unquote People's War, a theory of guerrilla warfare, and a step from secret to active rebellion. Sison and Buscaino had the support of Mao himself, or at least their Communist Party had the support of his. In the Sino-Soviet split, Sison had placed his new faction firmly in the China camp. At first, the new party and the New People's Army took over the infrastructure of the Huks in Luzon, while being bolstered by weapons supplied by Mao through his People's War Doctrine supply network for communist rebellions in the region. The power of the communists began to rapidly increase after their formation, not just because of the arms, but also because Sison began planting seeds of social revolution in universities and other areas of academic life in which he could spread influence, forming multiple student organizations, some led by scholars and some by students. And as the American-backed president, Ferdinand Marcos, began his second term in office in the spring of 1970, the party founded a year earlier had already attracted mass support and brought the country to a halt, with Sison fermenting chaos throughout Philippine society, using his youth and student groups to influence politics, with the communist youth groups forming one power base and the New People's Army forming another. Shortly after Marcos' second inauguration in 1970, communist protesters broke into the presidential palace, 2 of which were killed, throwing rocks and Molotov cocktails, setting off a series of demonstrations, some of which resulted in more deaths, throughout the first 3 months of 1970, which became known as the First Quarter Storm. After the communists had lost their weapons in a raid the previous year, they had one of their agents, an instructor at a Philippine military academy, raid the school for weapons and then defect. This was a major loss of credibility for the Philippine army, which was often already accused of favoring the rebels. To deal with the societal turmoil and communist threat, a constitutional convention was called by the Philippine Congress in late 1970 to be convened in 1971. However, once the convention opened, it was bogged down by all sorts of delays and corruption, eventually stretching into 1972. Realizing that his constitutional opponents would not be cowed, and facing multiple fronts of social revolution, Marcos declared martial law on September 23, 1972. This came just over a month after the Plaza Miranda bombing in August of '72, which at the time was portrayed as just another communist attack, indeed the one that prompted martial law, but since then private documents of CIA operatives in the Philippine Army have been discovered that were of the opinion that Marcos had potentially staged a false flag attack to bolster his case for martial law. In any case, he rammed through the new constitution the next year, and the Cold War nature of the struggle was firmly ingrained for the next phase of the conflict, with Marcos's classicalist dictatorship opposing the communist China-backed Maoist rebels. However, the Philippines' international patron, America, would soon enter into a détente with Communist China, resulting in the cooperation between the Philippine government and the Chinese Communist Party to cut off support for the Communist Party of the Philippines and their rebellion. But Sissone's group did not relent, and indeed after leaving Luzon, they had moved to guerrilla operations, based mainly out of Mindanao, but taking place throughout the country, and even establishing international branches in foreign countries to recruit potential ideological allies from around the world to come and join the struggle. Their guerrilla struggle was continuing into the late 70s, and by the early 80s they had turned Mindanao into a stronghold, finding many allies among the disaffected Lumad population, many of whom found claims to their traditional land made by large corporations or absentee aristocrat landowners, which the rebels say pushed them into this revolutionary guerrilla society. Another reason that the Lumad areas made fertile ground for NPA and Communist Party membership was that the Lumad population, along with the Moro population, which I'll touch on later, declined over the course of the 20th century due to Christian settlement from northern areas of the Philippines. Much of this took place during the American period, but the policy was continued by the Philippines government after independence, and by the time of the Marcos era, both the Moro and Lumad populations had noticeably declined. However, the steady growth of the communist guerrillas in the mid-1970s came to a stiff halt in 1976. Communist China, the #1 backer of the guerrillas, ceased its support after Mao Zedong's death as it softened relations with America and other classicalist powers, and dropping its support for some Maoist guerrilla movements abroad, including the communist movement in the Philippines. However, the Philippine communists were able to find support from other left-leaning organizations throughout the world, including the Sandinistas, the Shining Path, and the Kim family. Even with the American détente at the time with the Communist Party of China and the end of the CCP's support for the Philippine communists, along with America's pullout from Vietnam and the victory of communism there, it remained an American Cold War priority to help Marcos wipe out his communist opponents, especially given that they had remained Maoist after the death of Chairman Mao, and in many ways their tactics and choice of words were reminiscent of that of the Khmer Rouge, which had just risen to power in Cambodia or Kampuchea. With the support of its newfound global backers, which of course no longer included the CCP and still did not include the Soviet Union due to the group's Maoist leanings, nor Vietnamese support for the same reason, the Philippine guerrillas rebuilt their strength in the early to mid-1980s. Their guerrilla actions continued to disrupt society, which remained under martial law until 1981, and thereafter remained under the dictatorial presidency of Marcos, with the idea that, similar to Latin American countries who adopted military dictatorships in this period, the Philippines was fighting an internal war, something that in most of these cases was true, including on two fronts in the Philippines, regardless of whether the threat of social revolution and communist rebellion is justification for a classicalist dictatorship. The Philippine people gave their opinion on the matter in 1986 as Marcos bowed to international pressure and called elections, which he subsequently won. However, there were large accusations of fraud, and the populace swelled up in revolt, with over 2 million protesters filling the streets and Marcos ordering the military not to shoot. Eventually, on American advice, Marcos stood down and his opponent, Corazon Aquino, took over the presidency and within a year democratized the country and had a new constitution promulgated, keeping the country firmly anti-socialist while ending the dictatorship and the military's primary role. Thus, the internal war would now continue with constitutional oversight. Perhaps for that reason, or others, the communist rebellion has indeed continued all the way to the present day. Despite the New People's Army having about a fifth of the numbers that it did during its peak, it still finds success in drawing in the local Lumad population of Mindanao and other peasants who oppose landowning corporations and other business ventures in rural areas. And of course, with it, the Philippine government. Over that time, the communist rebels have installed a power structure which has enabled them to claim territory. They do this by constructing camps, from where they either convince or coerce the local peasants to join their cause. This means training them, giving them weaponry, and an ideological Maoist education. These peasants, some of which own businesses, can continue living and working in their rural towns and establishments, but when the New People's Army moves to do the same thing somewhere else, these peasants and business owners remain in their homes and places of living to defend communist territory from any government intrusions, which almost never happen anyway due to the remoteness of these areas. Meanwhile, Communist Party tax collectors collect the taxes from these local businesses, which they do allow to stay in operation. Thus, the Communist Party of the Philippines and its New People's Army have carved out a rural sphere of control in Mindanao and have actually succeeded in their mission of preventing development of these lands as the guerrilla war continues. The Communist Party also has proxies in the Philippine political system, in education, in law, and in a number of other professions to advocate for its causes and push its propaganda. Since 2016, this has drawn the ire of Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte, the former mayor in Davao City. There, Duterte used de facto martial law and summary executions to reel in the illicit drug trade and associated violence. Duterte promised to bring this campaign nationwide, and when elected president, his tactic of using the strongest available methods, including force, became applicable to the Philippines' national problems, including the communist rebellion in Mindanao, with which Duterte was indirectly familiar. As president, Duterte declared that the communist rebellion was the #1 threat to the Philippines' national security, even over the at times more violent Islamist and Moro conflicts. The communist spreading of ideological propaganda through rural schools, along with front organizations in urban areas, and their intentions against classicalist politics and capitalist economics, including their MO of committing sabotage attacks against multinational companies to scare them out of development of rural areas, all combined to make the Communist Party of the Philippines the #1 threat in a range of many identified by the Duterte regime. As would be expected, America is helping the Philippines fight this guerrilla revolution, just as it has against the other insurgencies in the country. But in this case, given the context, partly for the purpose of preserving classical politics in the islands and ending the revolutionary propaganda of the Communist Party of the Philippines. An interesting dynamic, however, is that despite the growing Cold War footing in both America and Communist China, the CCP has continued to stay away from the conflict, mainly because it plays spoiler with America for the favor of the Philippines government itself, and therefore has no reason to support the Maoist insurgency. Instead, it tries to protect the lucrative ties it's already built since 1976, when it stopped supporting the Philippine communists. Duterte has been happy to play the game, using this as a bargaining chip to get further support from America after a falling out with the Obama administration. These days, with the Philippines back in the American fold and Washington more determined than ever to keep the CCP out of the Philippines, especially as the Philippines continues signing infrastructure deals with the CCP, America has taken a more active role in the Philippines, assisting the government against all three insurgencies, with Duterte, of course, placing a particular emphasis on the communist rebellion. Even though the communists have not declared a state in the territory they control, using the methods that I detailed a little earlier, they've built a sizable territory in the rural countryside and mountains of northeastern Mindanao. This is also why they have representation on the apolitical world map, whereas a comparative movement in, say, India, the Naxalite communists, which may have once had a system like this, and that would actually be a very interesting topic to do a video on. But today, the Indian Maoists don't control any actual territory, as they've been suppressed effectively by the Indian government. The Duterte regime hopes for a similar result in the Philippines' own fight in Mindanao against the revolutionary communist forces. I can't discuss insurgency in the Philippines without discussing the Moro conflict as well, like the Lumad population of Mindanao. This insurgency is also focused on Mindanao, but it's focused on the western portions. The Islamic Moro population, like the Lumads, experienced decline during the 20th century and now forms the majority in only the westernmost provinces of Mindanao and its accompanying islands. During the Marcos years, Moro guerrilla organizations fought against government-backed Christian paramilitaries in areas of the countryside, with brutal massacres on each side of the conflict. At times, autonomous communities for the Moro people have been proposed under the name Bangsamoro or Moro homeland. However, even after the end of the Marcos regime, a transition back to peace never occurred. On March 21st of 2000, Philippine President Estrada declared all-out war against the Moro guerrillas, and the Philippine military was sent to Mindanao as guerrilla action against the state in Mindanao was beginning to cause chaos. By the end of the year, the army had subdued the rebel forces and secured Mindanao and its surrounding archipelagos. However, the peace did not last long, as several Islamic guerrillas then bombed the Philippine capital in response, resulting in multitudes of civilian deaths. Throughout the early 2000s, terrorism by these groups continued to increase drastically. Most of the bombings, kidnappings, and other terrorist actions were carried out in Mindanao, but some, like the Manila attacks, were carried out elsewhere. With the rise of Islamist terror across the globe in the same era, America established a branch of their terror-fighting operation known as Operation Enduring Freedom Philippines to assist the Philippine Army in repressing the guerrillas. The Americans no longer had a permanent presence in the Philippines after the closure of the Clark Air Force facility in 1991, but in 2002, American forces returned to the country and the rebels were largely, although again temporarily, suppressed. One of the reasons this was seen as such a threat of terrorism was because Moro areas of the country had been infiltrated by Islamist terrorists, such as the Abu Sayyaf group, which committed most of the wide-scale terrorist attacks that occurred throughout the 2000s. The Moro guerrillas opposed this as it hurt their case. However, a Moro splinter group known as the Rogue Elements staged a coup on Sulu and declared the Bangsamoro Republic in Talipao on Sulu. Later, Moro rebels took civilians hostage and raised the flag of the Bangsamoro Republic above the city hall of Zamboanga. After 2 weeks of grueling urban warfare, the Philippine Army recaptured the area, and early the next year, the Moros signed a peace agreement with the government, ending 40-plus years of conflict. The Moros agreed to the long-proposed autonomous community under the name Bangsamoro. This is a very large concession from a unitary state like the Philippines, which agreed to devolvement and the granting of a Moro homeland. However, if anything, this only increased the resolve of the Islamist rebels, which now swore their loyalty to the new Islamic State in the Middle East. In the Duterte era, violence continued, with a bombing of his old city, Davao, and other skirmishes with pro-government forces and Philippine troops. In 2017, another Islamist faction, known as the Islamic State of Lanao, led by foreign Islamist fighters, attacked and took over the city of Marawi. On May 23rd, the same day as the attack, Duterte declared martial law in Mindanao and ordered a military operation against the rebels. Even more grueling urban warfare awaited this time as the Islamist rebels fought to the death against Philippine forces. In a rare occasion, both America and China backed the Philippines in this operation. With the city of Marawi in ruins and carnage on both sides, plus multitudes of dead civilians, the Philippine Army recaptured the battered city. This, however, did not mark the end of Islamist violence in Mindanao, and Abu Sayyaf, which continues to declare allegiance to the Islamic State, or the concept of one, despite the collapse of the parent Islamic State in the Middle East, has continued its terror bombings in the years since. I previously had Abu Sayyaf's proclaimed emirate of the Islamic State still on the map, even after the loss of the Battle of Marawi and the subsequent dissolution of the Islamic State of Lanao, the Mate group. So, although Abu Sayyaf and other minor Islamist groups continue to stage bombings, also sabotaging infrastructure, at the time of the research for this video, it does not appear that they have held any territory since the loss of the Battle of Marawi in 2017, although their removal from the map again should not be confused with inactivity. In fact, Duterte, following an Islamist bomb attack in 2019, renewed his 2017 declaration of all-out war against the Islamist rebels. rebels. So although the communist insurgency is the top priority and the #1 challenge of the Philippine government due to its continuing strength and its continuing territorial nature, domestic Islamist terror remains a major policy focus of the Philippines in 2021. Again, though, the top priority remains the communist rebellion, which is one of the least known yet most interesting conflicts in the world today when you consider how significant it is within the Philippines and the foreign powers involved, including Communist China's break from the Communist Party of the Philippines and its very conspicuous continuing lack of support today, which reveals part of the CCP's strategy in its new great power competition with America, in that it's not supporting the communist rebels against the American-friendly classicalist government, but instead covertly and overtly attempts to co-opt the current Philippines government itself. But there are obviously other factors at play besides geopolitics and ideology, including the domestic cultural politics of the Philippines and its internal power dynamics, making the communist rebellion in the Philippines one of the most unusual and multifaceted conflicts in the world today. Thank you so much for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe. Donate on Patreon if you can. I'm Alex. I am out.